Countless lives have been saved since blood transfusions were first introduced in the 17th century. Initially, some members of the medical community were hesitant to use them, but transfusions were soon seen as vital in the replenishment of blood lost through trauma, illness or in the operating theater. In many ways, transfusions are a medical marvel, providing a safety net for times when procedures don't quite go according to plan. Transfusions also represent a lifeline for people with inherited blood disorders, with certain rare diseases or who are undergoing chemotherapy. But the field of transfusion medicine is changing. Instead of seeing it as an inert recharging of fluid, we're now coming to appreciate that a blood transfusion is essentially a liquid organ transplant, which comes with its own risks and drawbacks. Blood occupies a strange and somewhat privileged position in modern medicine, and it has evolved as a treatment option without the same level of research scrutiny, at least on the patient outcomes side of things, that other treatments are subjected to. Nowadays, if you have a modern pharmaceutical, it goes through the whole process of clinical trials before it's registered, but blood didn't come to health that way. As far back as 1990, studies were hinting that blood transfusions carried more risks than had previously been thought, and it was quickly becoming apparent that the mere fact a patient received a blood transfusion was a risk factor and in some instances was associated with poorer outcomes. Research up to now has been far from comprehensive. Restrictive transfusion studies, where a transfusion was only given if a patient's hemoglobin levels dropped to a certain point, did not appear to leave the patient any worse off. In a perfect world, however, scientists would do a clinical trial. People would be randomly assigned to one of three groups: some would have a blood transfusion, others would be given a placebo and others no transfusion at all. Scientists would then compare how each group fared. But a trial such as this would never get approved, because why would you give a blood transfusion to someone who didn't need one, even in a clinical trial setting? By the same token, why risk not giving blood to someone who might well die?
Cystic fibrosis is a condition that causes mucus to be thicker and stickier than it should be. Dr. Takata Hain specializes in cystic fibrosis treatment and is here to share her thoughts on caring for people with the condition today. Can you tell us a bit more about patients who suffer from cystic fibrosis? Absolutely, sufferers tend to carry 2 to 5 times as much salt in their bodies as those without our condition. So you can see why that is thicker than average treatment. For these patients is usually quite time-consuming. And repetitive patients are often required to stay in the hospital for long stretches. And as the symptoms of the condition begin to present very early on in the patient's life. Many of my patients are young people, and so we tend to see lots of patients with cystic fibrosis. Finding these hospital visits frustrating, right? In fact, throughout the UK, about 80% of patients with cystic fibrosis who are hospitalized report feeling at least minimal levels of depression. How about young patients who aren't currently hospitalized or can be challenging about their treatment? Well, patients can be required to take around 30 pills a day to keep cystic fibrosis under control. So it's understandable that teenagers and young people who just want to be free and independent might resent this ordeal, if they think they can get away with it. One of the most difficult things we have to contend with is the fact that if patients stop taking their medication or doing their daily breathing treatments, their condition won't immediately worsen. Instead, it will gradually become more severe until they contract a serious infection, which puts their lives at risk. So, what approaches do you use when treating patients with cystic fibrosis? Well, we found distraction therapy to be useful. We're incredibly lucky to have received a donation of a number of virtual reality headsets following their success in a number of treatment trials. We use the virtual reality headsets to transport the patient to outdoor settings, often corresponding to the activities they're required to do with us when they complete breathing exercises on a stationary bike. For example, the VR headsets display a virtual outdoor bike ride our patients. I find it's helpful to pretend to be somewhere else during treatment, and it's often easier for us to administer breathing treatments to patients using these headsets as they're more relaxed when they're not focused on the actuality of the test. So what sorts of changes have you seen in your patients as a result of these methods? One of my patients, a 24-year-old man with cystic fibrosis who was in hospital waiting for a lung transplant, Well, he found treatment very difficult at first. He preoccupied by his need for a transplant and frustrated by feelings of powerlessness. He would often resist treatment. We started using the virtual reality systems with him as soon as we got them, and it took a while for him to get on board. But when he did, it was like someone had breathed new life into him. Not only did he stop him during his treatment, he actually began to look forward to it. He's even started helping us to think about other ways we can improve the experiences of our patients, like improving social interaction. Yes, I understand that there are difficulties involved in patient communication. We're looking into the possibility of instant messaging functions between patients and even virtual games that they can play against each other. Unfortunately, patients with cystic fibrosis have to be kept apart to avoid cross-infection. It's just one more cross to bear for our patients that they can't talk to those going through the same thing. Our patients get plenty of interaction with myself and the rest of the staff, but would like to make sure they have access to a network of fellow sufferers to offer support and advice. I see that all sounds quite futuristic. Are there any other advances on the horizon for the treatment of cystic fibrosis? Well, there's a new drug that's been in the news recently. It's a combination of Lamgafter and Isaac. After you might know it by the brand name Oet B. The drug works by improving the level of by reducing the thick mucus that causes illness and respiratory issues in those with cystic fibrosis. Even more exciting and futuristic, there is the possibility of gene therapy where the genetic mutation that causes cystic fibrosis in individuals is replaced with a healthy gene. This condition can significantly extend the lives of thousands of people and remove the